All right, I think we are good to roll through. This should be recording. Remember that the PowerPoint slides will not move through Zoom. Blame Zoom, not me. But you do have the PowerPoint slides independently of the Zoom. You don't have a recording right now currently of lecture 3.2, but you will after today. So that's what I'm doing. So this is where we left off. We continue with our discussion of who were the people we call our founding fathers. This is the big point. We kind of have now, after last Tuesday's lecture, kind of answered the advocates for building a mighty empire. What about that word Republican? Where does that come in? And that is where we kind of turn our attention today. There we are. So as we left off, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was still no colonists are talking about breaking away from England at that point. It is really unthinkable. Even up to the immediate years right before the War for Independence, it's unthinkable for the colonists to imagine themselves as somehow not English or not wanting to be part of the English Empire. The English Empire was where it was at in the world. Nevertheless, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, as we discussed, really what was a problem. It really suggested that the interests or the needs of the colonists in North America were not squaring very well with policies coming out of the motherland. And that will continue as we go forward. So, you know, Coach didn't talk to you probably much about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's there in the background, but what really the colonists began fighting over after 1763 are the taxes, right? The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765. You'll be reading about all the taxes and the conflict over the taxes in Yup. I'll go back in a few of these, like we'll talk a little bit more about the Stamp Act crisis in a future lecture. And the quartering, all that stuff that Coach covered. Yup, we'll cover that as well too. I am not so much concerned about the Boston Massacre versus the quartering of troops and the Molasses Act and the Tea Act and throwing the tea overboard, that kind of stuff. This is the main point I want you to take away from today. Events, incidents, happenings in history are not self-interpreting. We bring interpretations, we bring interpretive lens to these things. There's more than just one way to understand a particular act or policy or event. Now, I've kind of already started you thinking along these lines. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, from the standpoint of the Crown Parliament, it just made sense. Why did the 7 Years' War begin? Because George Washington and his buddies in Virginia wouldn't respect the boundaries of Indian country. They wouldn't respect the boundaries of France. They kept crossing that line. So it makes sense. Let's draw another line. Say, hey, George Washington, your buddies, don't go over that line. We don't want to fight another war. We don't want to spend all the money fighting another war. We don't want to keep redcoats in North America forever. It's a lot of money to do that. So the Royal Proclamation looks like a sensible policy from the standpoint of the Crown. From the standpoint of the colonists, as we talked about, this looked like England is trying to keep us in the basement. England is not allowing us to grow up. England is not allowing us our due independence as Englishmen. The taxes that are coming along, similarly, can be understood in different ways. As I suggested, England won the 7 Years' War, but they went significantly in debt doing so. They have a massive war debt to pay down. It used to be the case, until your lifetime, it used to be the case that when you fought a war, you paid for it. In your lifetime, we fight not just one war, not just two wars, but 3 wars, and we cut taxes. And we have a $32 trillion national debt, and everybody's like, how is that possible? Well, maybe because we fight wars we don't pay for anymore. Eventually, you guys, or maybe your children, are gonna have to pay for them. I'll be dead by then, so whatever. Fight as many wars as you want. I don't care. Spend as much money in the military as you want. I'm not going to be here, so maybe it's going to fall to my kid, but I don't like him much anyway. So I do. I love my kid. I do. Don't go saying anything. Anyway, now I'm completely off track because you think I'm a terrible father. All right, let me get back on. Yes. Maybe you're definitely your kids are going to have to pay for that. You're going to have to pay for those wars at some point. But in your lifetime, we decided to fight like 3 wars and cut taxes. And it's just so stupid. But this is American politics. It used to be you fight a war, you pay for it. England's trying to pay for its war. And it was a war that was largely fought here in North America, defending the British colonists here in North America. And so from the standpoint of the Parliament and the Crown, hey, people in the North American colonies need to pay a little bit more in taxes. We need to place some new taxes on them to help pay down our war debt. And so the colonists, like all good Englishmen, like their sugar. Okay, let's put a tax on sugar. Eventually it'll be a tax on tea. Stamps, right? Public documents. All right, let's figure out ways that we can raise some revenue. And yes, taxes were going up on the citizens of England during this time too. But the idea was North American colonists, they should pay more because we just fought a war to defend them. And we're keeping the redcoats there in case something else happens in the next few years. And the colonists should kind of pay for, taking care of our soldiers, right? The taxes made complete sense. The quartering of soldiers made complete sense to Parliament, given the amount of debt that England had gone into fighting this war. Now, did the colonists feel the same way about the taxes? Some of you know this already. You've already gone through. You've already gone through YOP Chapter 5. Others you will get there, but you generally know from Coach that the taxes were a problem. You maybe don't remember the upset over the Sugar and the Stamp Act, but certainly you remember the upset over the Tea Act, right, in the 1770s. The taxes are a problem. And this is the kind of language that you see coming out of the colonists. The Sugar Act, the Molasses Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act. You're trying to enslave us. You're tyrannizing us. And and seriously, the Parliament, and I totally get this. The Parliament and the Crown are just like, what the heck are you guys talking about? Like, do you know that even though the colonists were paying new taxes, they were still being taxed less than people in England? It wasn't that great of a tax burden that was being placed upon them. And so why this upset? Why complain about taxes being some kind of form of enslavement? Particularly for people who really knew enslavement, right? They had 350,000 people in enslavement. So when the colonists complained about being enslaved, they knew what they were talking about. They had visible images of slavery, and they felt like England was trying to reduce them to slavery through taxes. Again, we have to understand the framework in which the colonists made sense of English policies. A couple economic factors to keep in mind before we get into an actual discussion here of republicanism. While England has a debt that it needs to pay down, the colonists in the 1760s are in the midst of an economic depression. And this generally happened after world wars. The 3 previous wars in the 1700s had disrupted trade and the economy before this. And so it's no surprise that the 7 Years' War, in many ways the world's first global war, really disrupted trade, international trade, for a country like British North America that was dependent upon international trade. A slowdown in international trade meant everybody was losing money, right? It wasn't just the planters who can't sell their goods because nobody's buying tobacco because, hey, we're fighting a war. We just got done fighting a war. Who wants to buy tobacco at a time like this? To the people who work the docks and the people who man the ships, right? Working class, planter class, everybody is affected by a slowdown in trade. Everybody is enduring economic hardship. At a time in which several colonists, particularly the wealthier Virginia planters, were in a pretty good amount of debt. Right. I mean, the colonists didn't invent conspicuous consumption, but they were certainly practicing conspicuous consumption by the 1750s and 1760s. It wasn't just that they, needed the latest clothes. It wasn't just that they had to buy their clothes from England, is that they wanted the most fashionable clothes, right? They wanted to present themselves as the best that England had to offer. The colonists, those with wealth, wanted that, and they were willing to go into debt in order to have those clothes, to have those purses, to have those books, to have those carriages, right? We'll be talking about a very famous carriage a few lectures down the road, right? If you could afford, or at least you could justify the debt to have one of the latest carriages. Hey, getting around places like New York and Philly during this time, when you're at literal horsepower. You talk about emissions problems with cars. Horses, it's a little bit different, right? You really enjoy being able to ride around in a carriage when you can. So you're able to afford or justify the debt for one of these carriages. So understand what's going on here. The war has disrupted trade, so less profit coming in. People are in debt or not working. They're unemployed. It's a time of economic depression. And now the taxes are coming in. Now England's trying to raise taxes. Look, for all that happened in the Great Recession in 2009, 2011, your lifetime, one thing that did not happen is America did not raise taxes. Because it's a basic truism. You don't raise taxes in the midst of a depression or in the midst of a recession. You, in fact, try to figure out how to maybe lower taxes or lower expenses, or you do like stimulus checks. You all know your stimulus checks, right? Yeah, right. You try to give government money back to people to help encourage spending. You don't try to take money away from people through increasing taxes. Where did Americans learn that lesson? You don't tax in the midst of economic hardship. They learned it in the 1760s and 1770s because this is what England was trying to do. We need to understand the socioeconomic context. It's not like things were going great in the colonies and England was like, hey, pay more for sugar. Hey, start paying for like a postage stamp. Hey, pay more for tea. The context was England is at a time of economic hardship, putting these taxes upon us. What happens in the 1760s and 1770s when you can't pay your taxes? You lose your property, right? You lose your land, you lose your house. Sheriff comes and takes it. Taxman comes and takes it. You lose your property. You lose your property in most colonies in the 1760s and 1770s. You lose your property. What else do you lose? A particular kind of freedom, right? Yeah, the freedom to vote, because most colonies had property qualifications for voting. And so taxes imposed during a time of economic hardship threatened property rights. Threatening property rights threatens one's political identity. This is how the colonists got there. This is how a George Washington or Thomas Jefferson could get from taxes on tea to you're trying to enslave us. If increased taxes meant loss of property rights, meant loss of political identity, loss of the ability to vote, then yeah, you would be reduced to a kind of enslavement. And the significant characteristic of slaves, after all, is that they have no political identity, no political rights, essentially. Through taxes, the colonists could imagine, whether it was actually happening or not, they could imagine losing their political identities and not simply just their economic livelihood or their property. And so we do have to understand, what's going on, why why the taxes are, why England thought it was such a mystery that the colonists were so upset. Right? It made complete sense from the standpoint of Parliament and the Crown. We fought a war to defend you guys. Now you should pay more in taxes to pay down the war debt. Right? The British policy, in other words, was completely sensible. But British policy is also occurring within an economic context in which the colonists were feeling very economically insecure. And the taxes just added to that insecurity, added to that anxiety, and added to that unrest. The no taxation without representation was in many ways just a scaffolding. I wouldn't say necessarily it's a fiction, but it's a scaffolding. It's something that's put out there to hide what's really going on. And what's really going on is that colonists, even wealthy colonists, were faced with declining profits, increasing personal debt, and the potential loss not just of their property, but of their political identities as well, too. But if it was just that, I don't think you get a revolution. We need to understand the political mindset of the founders and what they were kind of where they were coming from, right? We need to understand not simply what they were against monarchy, but we need to understand what they were for. And what they were for could be summed up in one word: republicanism. The main subject of today's lecture is unpacking the 18th century idea of republicanism. Immediately, do not think of the Republican Party. Yes, the name Republican Party ultimately derives from this political philosophy of republicanism, but they are different. So you'll hear me refer to this as kind of like small r republicanism. Small r republicanism. This is a political philosophy that dates back to the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks and the Romans built the world's first republics. Throughout history, from the Roman Empire up until the 18th, up into the 17th, the 18th century, different people groups around the world try to develop republics. And ultimately, the people we call our founding fathers would declare independence from England in the name of building here in North America a republic. Not just a mighty empire, but a mighty republican empire. So we need to understand, to understand founding fathers, we need to understand their political philosophy of republicanism, smaller republicanism. And I've kind of developed, sorry, we'll go back and forth between slides. Some key words to understanding 18th century republicanism. At the center of republic literally is the public. Republican form of government is ultimately a government that allows, encourages publics to form by giving publics freedom, and government ultimately proceeds not from the individuals that make up the public, but from the publics themselves. A Republican society is one that's characterized by freedom, but freedom for particular political actions, right? All the First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, freedom of religion, those are not just random freedoms that they just decided to throw together in one. Those are the basic Republican freedoms. You can't have publics forming In other words, you can't have the people of Jackson or the people of Spring Arbor or the people of Stars Hollow getting together to talk with each other unless they have the freedom to do so. So they need to have free speech, talk with each other, and debate freely about whether they want a dog leash law or whether they want to pay taxes for a sewage system, or whether they want to kill deer with, whatever. Without freedom of assembly, publics literally can't form, right? Unless Gil Morris and Luke Daines can all get together with Taylor and Stars Hollow. Yeah, thank you. At least one person is, yeah, right. We need freedom of assembly to get there and have that town meeting together. Freedom of religion. You can't have one particular religion dictating the rights, the monies of all people outside of that religion, and then freedom of the press, right? You need to have news so you can have you need a free press so you can have an informed citizenry, so they know exactly what are the pros and cons of a leash law, pros and cons of shooting reindeer. I don't know why we're shooting reindeer today, but I guess we are. So the First Amendment rights, which we have come for different reasons to interpret as, I have a right to free speech and Noah has a right to freedom of assembly. We interpret these in very individualistic ways. I think it's a loss. The people who wrote, the people who led our revolution and wrote up our first governments, those First Amendment freedoms are Republican freedoms, meaning that we are supposed to use our freedoms to do a particular thing, which we are supposed to get together and have a conversation about. We were just talking about what makes for a good president, right? The First Amendment rights allow us to get together. The First Amendment assumes that we get together, we have those kind of conversations with each other. Ultimately, Republican society is a free society. The great enemy of a republic is centralized power. Republican philosophy is in many ways a philosophy. It's almost a conspiracy theory. A good Republican is constantly looking over their shoulder because they are worried that somehow somebody is looking to take away their freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of press. They're constantly worried somebody's trying to take their freedom. And the best way then to preserve freedom is through checks and balances. The mark of a Republican society is ultimately a society that separates powers, that provides checks and balances on power, that prevents, creates government that prevents this power being centralized in one particular individual or one particular office. Republican society is characterized by the government of a Republican society is characterized by checks and balances, separation of powers. In this way, no one government agency can come in and take away your Republican rights, those basic First Amendment rights. But the assumption is nevertheless that in a Republican society, you care. This is in many ways a significant distinction between a Republican and a Democratic society. In a Democratic society, in many ways, you have a right to not care. You have a right to not engage. At least is the way that we define democracies today. A Republican society, the expectation is everybody cares. Everybody gets together. Everybody does the Stars Hollow town meeting thing. Everybody talks. Everybody deliberates. Because the alternative is just too dangerous. And when we come together to talk with each other about good government and good policy and good offices and what we want from our leaders, when we come together, the expectation is that we come together as virtuous individuals. This is a huge means of defining republicanism, central to republicanism. The freedom is central to republicanism. Virtue is as well too. We need to understand virtue in an 18th century context. Virtue is not. Well, sorry, I'm getting at this one. A virtuous person in the 18th century sense is a disinterested person, which is not what you are in this lecture right now. Disinterested person means a person. You see, you're so disinterested, you're not even get the particular joke about being disinterested. God. Okay. A disinterested person is a person who doesn't pursue their particular interests, or they don't put their private interests over what the 18th century called the public interest or the public good. A virtuous person is a person who, yes, is self-interested, but when they get together in publics and they're debating with each other, their ultimate concern is figuring out what is best for all of us, not as what is best for Mark, but what is best for all of us here. And maybe what's best for all of us means a curtailment on Mark's interest or Mark's freedom. Mark needs to have the character to say, okay, even though this means a little bit of a loss of my freedom or a little bit of a hardship for me, that's a sacrifice I'm willing to pay for the good of the whole. This is an example of 18th century kind of thinking. This is John Adams writing to a lady in 1776. Let me skip down a little bit. Notice that he's talking there a lot about virtue cannot exist in a nation without private and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. There must be a positive passion for the public good, the public interest, honor, power, glory established in the minds of the people, or there can be no republican government or any real liberty. And this public passion must be superior to all private passions. Men must be ready. They must pride themselves and be happy to sacrifice their private pleasures, passions, and interests, nay, their private friendships and dearest connections when they stand in competition with the rights of society. You have here John Adams espousing a key principle of republicanism, that a good Republican citizen is a virtuous citizen, meaning that they put the public interest ahead of their private interest. Now, there's different ways of theorizing democracy, but the primary way that we theorize democracy, or have for a long time, is that democracy is a society in which we all pursue our individual interests, and somehow magically things work out. Now, I don't want to say there's no truth in that, but I will simply say this. That is not the worldview of the people that we call our founding fathers. The reason I point this out, I don't know that any of you do this, but maybe you have family members or drunk uncles at Thanksgiving or Christmas that you'll encounter who will say things like, we just need to get back to the constitutional principles and the principles of the founders of this country. Well, yeah, nobody wants that, because we are so far politically, or in terms of our political culture, we are so far away from the ideals of our founding fathers. We are pretty radically democratic in this idea of sacrifice of one's self-interest for the good of the public interest. Honestly, these guys sound like a bunch of commies, sound like a bunch of socialists, but they weren't. They were the people who led the American Revolution and wrote our constitutions. Okay, and they imagined building in America a republican society, a society characterized by virtuous leadership and by virtuous citizenship, where we all did take a political interest and we routinely got together to figure out what exactly is the public interest. Is a leash law or shooting reindeer or taxes for a new sewer line? Is that ultimately in the public interest? If it is, then we all should contribute to it, even if that means John has to pay taxes and John really hates paying taxes. Well, suck it up, John. You're part of the public, and so you need to pay those taxes. A couple of things before we move on. The things that unite are in some ways the things that divide us at the same time. Whereas there is among your John Adams and Ben Franklins and George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons and Alexander Hamiltons, all of these big name guys who appear in the Hamilton musical. That's how you know them, right? You don't know them from Coach, you know them from watching the Hamilton musical. All these individuals shared a common political culture and worldview known as republicanism. A couple of kind of side points that I want to make about republicanism, and we can move on to kind of where they learned it from and how they put it into practice. First, as much as republicanism united the framers, it's also a dividing line for them. They particularly divided over the question, who could be virtuous or who needed to be virtuous. You had different versions of republicanism out there. In many ways, it was as diverse as, well, George Washington had his opinion, James Madison had his opinion, and Ben Franklin had his opinion, but they kind of fell into two camps. There was a more elitist. There was a more elitist version of republicanism. As we'll go through lectures, espoused by George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. These are the ones who would become leaders in the 1790s of the Federalist Party. These were individuals, as you'll read through Yop and as we continue through lectures, you'll see that these individuals, well, honestly, they weren't sure that everyone in a society was capable of being a good Republican. They weren't sure that what John Adams called the common herd of mankind. Yes, those are his terms. Common herd of mankind. They weren't sure that they were capable of virtuous action. Now, who are the common herd of mankind? I'm actually now elevated over it. For about 25 years, I probably would be considered part of the common herd of mankind. But then I got educated. So I'm probably good to go. Probably what John Adams and Thomas Jefferson would call part of the natural aristocracy now. Because I bettered myself. I used my freedom to better myself. You guys, you're probably still, you're still probably the common herd. You're not quite there yet. Hopefully, you'll complete your college degrees and you'll move on to be informed citizens, and then maybe you can become part of the natural aristocracy too. But for right now, yeah, you're the common herd, and John Adams would say, we really shouldn't trust you very much. In terms of your political voice. Sorry, not very democratic. But these guys weren't very democratic. Instead, it was enough for Adams, Washington, and Hamilton. It was enough for these elitist Republicans that the leaders were virtuous. Noah Ortel is, at least not now, capable of virtuous action. Start there. But as long as George Washington is, we're okay. Right? Everybody can just, all right, all the common herd of mankind can just fall in line behind George Washington. We'll be all right. You'll see these guys, elitism, come up at different times in the lectures down the road. But I needed to kind of foreshadow that for you. And then on the other side, you had a more democratic form. Now, generally, the word democracy didn't come up during this time of the late 1700s. It usually didn't come up unless it was like a curse word, right? I mean, democracy, people use democracy at this time in the way that people use socialism in the 1950s, right? It was intended to kind of paint you as an extremist and somebody who was just so who was so out of touch with reality. And so if you were labeled a Democrat in the 1770s or the 1780s, it wasn't a good thing. It was a way of suggesting, you're crazy. You have no idea what you're talking about. Eventually, the term democracy would become normalized, but it takes some time for it to come about. Nevertheless, even among people who were not necessarily using the term democracy, y'all can read that, right? No, you can't read that. That's all right. But you do have access to the PowerPoint in which you will be able to read it. That's Tom Paine. Paine and particularly Thomas Jefferson, eventually James Madison. We'll talk about Madison's an odd duck. He starts out on the elitist side and very quickly ends up on the Democratic side. But your Democratic Republican stalwarts are Tom Paine and then Thomas Jefferson. So you got Washington, Hamilton, and Adams on one side, the so-called Federalists. On the other side, you have people like Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson, who would be the anti-federalists and then would become in the 1790s known as the Democratic Republicans. So you have a lot of terminology coming at you quick. Don't worry, Yop's going to help you unpack that down the road. But I wanted, again, to kind of foreshadow that the people we call our founding fathers, yes, they were committed to building a particular kind of mighty empire here in North America, a Republican mighty empire. They wanted a Republican form of government, but they really disagreed on exactly what form a republic should take, who should exercise political rights and political power within that republic. For people like Tom Paine, Thomas Jefferson, in the second half of his rights, this excerpt from his Rights of Man in 1792, he's going to talk more about, kind of the democratic form of republic, which is what he will be an advocate for. We'll see Tom Paine come up in future lectures. Jefferson is this from the beginning as well, too. These were individuals who believed that there isn't a common herd of mankind. There's this kind of mankind. And everybody is capable of virtuous action. And so everyone should have political rights and opportunities. I mean, we'll see this fight played out at the level of property qualifications, removing property qualifications, adding property qualifications back in for voting, removing property qualifications for voting. Americans are going back and forth with each other for like the 50 years after independence, and it all has to do with this basic question. Who is capable of virtuous action? Is it just the wealthy and the educated? Yeah, I mean, there's a common assumption among people like Hamilton and Washington that wealthy people were more disinterested or capable of more disinterest than poor people, because as we all know about wealthy people never look to become wealthier, right? Wealthy people get to a certain level of wealth and they say, yeah, I'm good. So Jeff Bezos gets to 100 billion and he says, I don't need 200 billion. I'm good at 100 billion. So we can trust Jeff Bezos to be president of the United States, right? It doesn't exactly work that way. But this was the mindset of the more elitist the more elitist of the founding fathers, is that wealthy people were capable of a disinterest that poor people were not. So you have on one side people like Hamilton and Washington and Adams, imagining a much more elitist kind of republic. And then on the other side, people like Jefferson, Tom Paine, and Madison will kind of switch teams. He's a leading Federalist, and he becomes a leading Democratic, and then he becomes a leading Democratic Republican. Weird guy. But again, it kind of goes to this whole, wow, we just need to get back to the founding fathers. Well, which founding father and when? Because the founding fathers had significant disagreements with each other, and sometimes they changed their minds. At the end of I mean, in many ways, the whole point of lectures 3 through 5, one of the major takeaways should just be this: there never was a golden age in which we didn't have political conflict. There never was a golden age in which we had these leaders who were just suddenly like so competent and confident and always knew the right thing to do. American politics has always been messy. It's always been conflict. There is no golden age. There is just the age you're in, and hoping that the person you're having to deal with is committed to virtuous action as you are. Of course, that all assumes you're bringing virtue to the table as well, too. So as we go through lectures and as you read through Yop, you'll see that the people we call our founders, they disagreed with each other, but I think at root, their disagreement was over a core principle of republicanism, namely who was capable of virtue or who needed to be virtuous. For people like Paine and Jefferson, for a republic to hold, everybody needed to practice virtue. For people like Washington, Adams, the common herd of mankind just couldn't pull it off. You couldn't be virtuous. Yet. You'll get there, hopefully. Lord willing, you'll get there. That's why you're taking this history class. So elevate yourself beyond the common herd of mankind to become part of John Adams' natural aristocracy. Isn't that a noble goal? Isn't that a good reason to take a history class? What's that?
That's reason.
So, our founding fathers divided, and we'll see that, but understand what they're dividing over is a fight, an internal fight over republicanism. The other is I want to kind of step outside a little bit too and talk about, because virtue is key to helping to answer particular questions that I know that many of you have encountered because you're coming from Christian homes and some of you are coming from Christian schools, which is the role of, or the place of Christianity within America's founding. Particularly, did America have a Christian founding? We actually have an extra credit opportunity. So part of what I wanted you to, hopefully you didn't, go ahead and try to, write that last night or something. I wanted to kind of at least introduce it here, and then after this you can go and do that assignment if you want. But that's a nice extra credit opportunity. Please understand, when extra credit opportunities are offered, you got to take them. There is no like magic extra credit assignment when you have a D at the end of the semester and you're like, hey, is there an extra credit work I could do to make up this D? No, there isn't. There is extra credit work that is offered to you throughout the semester. This is offered to you, so I would recommend that you take advantage of it should you want the extra credit. But it's pertaining to this question: did America have a Christian founding? An understanding of republicanism, particularly an understanding of virtue, can help us answer that question, maybe in a better way than you got in schools. There seems to be a lot of extremes on this particular question, right? For many of you, if you went to a public school, coach and your textbooks aren't as good. It's not that they, don't acknowledge Christianity in the founding, but they do tend to downplay, or you're more likely to hear things like, "Wow, the founding fathers really weren't Christians; they were all deists," and things like that. And they go too far in downplaying the presence of Christianity during this period of our history. I should say, by the way, my first research paper as an undergraduate, 50-page paper on was America founded as a Christian nation. I went on to my area of specialization is American religious history, and now 30 years later. So I've been working on this question: did America have a Christian founding, for like 30 years. So I'm telling you, the public schools in general go too far in downplaying. In general, now it depends on who your coach was, but in general, what I've seen over the years is that they go too far in downplaying the Christianity at this time, the Christianity literally of the founding fathers. As a Christian homeschooler myself, speaking to a number of you who probably went to a Christian day school, speaking to a number of you who probably went to Christian private schools too, they go what much too far in saying that in overplaying the role of Christianity in this particular era as well too. And so there's a lot of extremes here that we have to try to kind of work our way through, and virtue can actually, the place of virtue and the way that the colonists talk about virtue can actually help us with this. Was America founded as a Christian nation? I think when some people, everything hinges upon, well, what exactly do you mean when you say founded? A lot of people focus on the Christian nation part. It really hinges more on what you mean by founded. And I know that a lot of the Christian school textbooks, what they try to suggest is that America was founded as a Christian nation, not socially or culturally, or in terms of religious institutions that were predominant at that time, but that politically, America was founded as a Christian nation. And that's just wrong. There are certain things over the years I've decided, I'm not going to bridge the gap or debate those kinds of issues. I'm just going to say you're just wrong on that. And so for those who would say America had a Christian founding, meaning that politically we're founded as a Christian nation, it's just wrong. And all you have to do is look at the actual words of the Constitution. I know getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. All you have to do, though, is look at and read the Constitution. And a couple of things you notice when you read the U.S. Constitution. One, it literally is God's. The word God does not appear there. Some students will, at this point, say, well, why does the president say at the end of their oath, so help me God? Read the Constitution. So help me God is not in the Constitution. George Washington added that. We'll get to Washington in a minute. Literally a godless constitution. When religion is addressed, it's only addressed negatively. It occurs in Article 6, Clause 3. The first part of Article 6, Clause 3 is what's called the Supremacy Clause, basically saying the U.S. Constitution trumps state laws. The second part says this: no religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office of public trust in the United States. No religious tests for office. There is the answer to the question. It's really that simple. I don't know why we've had so much heat and so little light over this particular issue. If, when we're trying to ask the question, was America founded as a Christian nation in a political sense? The answer emphatically is no. The Constitution and James Madison, who wrote it, clearly and clear, there are no religious tests for office. You can be an atheist under the U.S. government, under the U.S. Constitution. You do not have to swear oath to God. We'll say, well, yeah, well, they just didn't. They didn't know that at the time because there were no atheists. No, there were atheists. Tom Paine was considered an atheist. The friend of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and all these guys was known as an atheist. So there were atheists at the time. And when they said no religious test for office, they knew that they're creating a government in which a Tom Paine, an atheist. Well, yeah, but there were just Christians and atheists. There were no like Jews and Muslims. No, there were Jews and Muslims. They knew what they were talking about when they said no religious tests for office. The Constitution is a secular constitution. And I know the Christian school textbooks because I grew up under them and have read them over the years. Well, yes, but this theological principle is in there, and well, they're reading the Bible about but as a Christian and a Christian historian who studies these issues and just say and look politically, the answer is no, we are not founded as a Christian nation. Of course, that all depends on what you mean by Christian nation. Do you mean the United States of North America? Then the answer is because of Article 6. The answer is no, we were not founded as a Christian nation. But what if you look at the individual states? Because the United States, right, it's not just one thing, it's like all these other things too. While the United States established no religious tests for office, Massachusetts did. Massachusetts maintained a state church until 1830s. So maybe the United States was not founded as a Christian nation. Massachusetts was. Massachusetts was founded as a Christian nation. You did have, and in fact, most of the colonies, they actually didn't follow the Constitution with no religious test for office. Most of the colonies had religious tests for office. You had to swear some oath to God or governor of the universe or something like that. You had to make some kind of profession of faith to hold office in that particular state. And in a few of these states, they actually maintained state-supported churches into the 1800s. So there is no simple answer to this, was America founded as a Christian nation? If you're talking politically, the U.S. Constitution is religiously neutral. But if you're talking at the state levels, then you could say, yes, this state, yeah. They were officially, legally, politically, they were Christian nations. The best answer I've ever heard to this question actually came from a conservative Republican politician, Mike Huckabee. He isn't, and Mike Huckabee is showing my age here. But Mike Huckabee, back when he was running for presidency back in 2008, appeared on CNN, and everyone knew he was a pastor. And so Wolf Blitzer asked him, hey, was America founded as a Christian nation? And Huckabee responded, no, America was founded as a secular nation with a strong Christian heritage. That's a great answer. That is the right answer. And this brings us back to virtue, and it moves us on to good old George Washington. Whereas legally, politically, the United States of North America is religiously neutral. There are no religious tests for office. God is not in the Constitution. We are not legally, politically a Christian nation and never have been. Individual states, a different story, but nationally speaking, the answer is no. But then we go to the other extreme. Oh, the founding fathers, they're all deists, they weren't good Christians. No. Most of the founding fathers, like most of the population, were professing Christians. There was a great religious and theological diversity. The people we call our founding fathers, they actually were probably less theologically diverse than the population. The population is all over the place religiously. You'll read about their, hopefully you'll pick up something of the religious makeup of the country from the outlook. Our founders were a little bit more uniform. They were Christian, they just weren't Christian in the way that like SAU is Christian. Like if you invited George Washington to go to chapel with you, he'd probably run out like 5 minutes into worship. He'd think you all were a bunch of like cultish freaks. Because George Washington is a Christian, but he's an Anglican. Completely different kind of Christianity than your non-denominational Methodist, Baptist, low church, SAU, right? George Washington is not worshiping with us, right? He's Christian with us, but he's not worshiping with us. So when we say about the founding fathers or when the founding fathers weren't Christian, well, that goes too far. The founding fathers were Christian. They just weren't, they weren't like Methodists and Baptists. Most of them were Anglican. The Anglican Church is the Church of England. When the colonies split from England, the Anglican Church becomes the Episcopal Church. So if you ever heard the Episcopal Church, you're wondering where that comes from. That's where that comes from. The Episcopal Church is the Anglican Church in the United States. So Washington, all those guys became members then of the Episcopal Church after. So they are Christian, and they had a lot of different differences of opinion about the place of religion in public, and the place of religion in government. They generally let James Madison will be the author, will have the most say over America's religious liberty. Thomas Jefferson is not in the country. Madison is here. And Madison argues for a pretty strict separation. It's because Madison, you have no religious tests for office. It's because Madison, he writes the First Amendment, no religious establishment, all that. He maintains a much more strict separation between church and state than some of the other founders. One of the persons who actually disagreed with Madison, thought he went too far, was George Washington. We know that from George Washington because when it was time for Washington in 1788 to take the oath of office to be president of the United States, he asked God to the presidential oath. He wasn't supposed to do that. God's supposed to stay out of this Constitution. Madison was real clear about that. Washington's like, oh, I think we need God. And so he adds, "So help me God." And every president since then has just said, "So help me God." So it's kind of weird thing going on in the presidency. We think God's in there, but it's actually not in there. And God is in there because Washington says, "Well, I think we need it in there." Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable. Supports in vain that may claim to distribute a patriotism who should labor to subvert those great pillars of human happiness. These firmest props of the duties of men as citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. Volume could not trace all of their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked whether in the security for property, for reputation, for life, with the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice, and let us with caution indulge in supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined educational minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles. Y'all caught that, right? Yeah. What Washington is saying there is we need religion. We need to remain a religious people because religion teaches people to be moral. And the kind of society that we want to be, we don't want to be a mighty empire. We want to be a mighty Republican empire. Virtue is essential. Virtuous thinking, virtuous action is essential. Thus, we need our people to stay religious. The whole thing at the end, morality independent of religion. Look, this is 1780, 1790. This is advanced enlightenment. There were thinkers like David Hume who could imagine a morality derived from nature, independent of God. Washington is taking that idea on. He's saying, no, look, most people are going to get their morality from religion. So we need to make sure that if we want to stay a Republican people, that we stay a religious people. Which is why a lot of the founding fathers, while they accepted separation of church and state, many of them were also advocates for religious instruction, for government support for religious instruction, government support for religious celebrations, religious obligations, right? Washington himself sets the model. He didn't have to swear an oath to God. And we kind of need that. We kind of need God in public. We kind of need God in our courts. So understand how an understanding of republicanism helps us understand how the founders thought about the importance of Christianity to the future of the United States. It wasn't that our laws were going to be derived from Christianity or anything like that. They really resisted that. But Christianity is important because Christianity teaches us to love our neighbor. Christianity teaches us to be good people. And good people are virtuous people. Virtuous people help maintain a healthy republic. It is Christianity it's an instrumental understanding of religion. Christianity is valuable not because it's true. Christianity is valuable because it's useful. Christianity teaches us to be good people. It's not that Washington didn't believe that Christianity was true. It's just that Washington was like, we shouldn't be killing each other over whether we celebrate Easter on April 1st or April 14th. We don't want religion in our politics like that. But we want religion indirectly there. We want Christianity, in particular, throughout our public life. We want strong churches. We want religious instruction. We want religious oaths, George Washington is saying, because Christianity teaches us to love our neighbor, and that is the essence of virtuous thinking. It's an instrumental understanding of the importance of religion, and particularly of Christianity, to the United States. So, did America have a Christian founding? No. Did America have a Christian founding? Yes. That clears it up, doesn't it? Now you get to take over, read the CNN interviews. Just because my name's on it, I just collected those historians. Those are the experts on the question. I just got them together and had to edit their terrible prose. They're really bad. It took me a long time to edit their stuff, but I got it done. It's a really good series. A lot of different answers. Be aware when you're summarizing Amanda Porterfield versus John Fea, make sure you know who you're kind of citing. Don't say Edward says this and Edward says, I didn't say any of that stuff, right? It's all these different historians I assembled. Provide your summary of the 5 historians, and then you get to provide your own answer to the question, did America have a Christian founding? Okay. Now, after that 30-minute interlude, we can kind of get back on track to the actual lecture. this is kind of republicanism for dummies, the crash course in republicanism and debates that will occur about republicanism. Where did the framers learn about republicanism from? Ironically, they learned about it from the same place that they got the idea to be a mighty empire, right? What was the Americans' inspiration to build a mighty empire here in North America? It was the fact that they were already part of a mighty empire, the British Empire. Where did the colonists learn about republicanism from? They learned about it from English authors. Yes, England is a monarchy, but England, for about 100 years, had also been producing Republican thought. You don't need to remember this, the Glorious Revolution. Some of the members of the Glorious Revolution, 1689, the Whig Party, as they were called, wanted England to go further down the road of checking the power of monarchy, bolstering the power of Parliament, because this is consistent with Republican government, right? Republican governments, they check and balance power. You don't want power to be all to be centralized in a monarchy, for instance. England felt, many Englishmen felt like, hey, we're a monarchy, but we're actually a good republic. Because yes, we do have a king. There's a lot of good reasons to have a king. But power is really exercised through Parliament, this representative body. It took us a long time. It took the English a long time. It took them a civil war. It took them the death of their king during the 1600s to pull this out. But they eventually get there. England, a lot of Englishmen like to think of themselves in the 1700s as we're a monarchy, but we actually embody the principles of republicanism better than anyone else. We have a king, but power is really centralized in Parliament. The same holds for England today. Is England a monarchy today? But nobody expects Charles II to actually do any governing, right? That's all going to be done by the Prime Minister and through Parliament. So England, in other words, they figure out a way to embody Republican principles, smaller Republican principles, while maintaining a monarchy. Nevertheless, there were Englishmen during this time, the writers of Cato's letters, for instance, who said that England was not going far enough. Writers of Cato's letters, they weren't necessarily saying let's get rid of monarchy, but they were saying the king, queen, they still have too much power. We really need to make sure that our power is really checked and balanced here. We need to make sure that tyranny is really put in its place. We really need to do more as a country to embody Republican principles. We're not great right now. We could be better. As one of the Cato's writers put it, liberty, you are our alpha and omega, and when your virtue is gone, all is gone. Understand the linkage that Republican thinkers made between freedom and virtue. A people remain free as long as they remain virtuous. When people lose their virtue, when the leaders of a country lose their virtue or their capacity for virtue, freedom starts to go away. Power starts to become centralized. Groups who put their private interest above the public interest look to centralize power to themselves. Politicians who forget their calling to support the public interest, they look to take power to themselves. And a monarchy is particularly susceptible to this. So the writers of Cato's letters, they don't necessarily say England's not a republic, but they say we could be better. Why should we care about what a bunch of British authors care? Well, in an age like the 1700s, in the transatlantic, it's not just people, but it's ideas that move back and forth. And it's books. I already mentioned the colonists buying books. One of the books the people would call our founding fathers were buying was Cato's letters. It's estimated at the time of the American Revolution that 50% of libraries in North America had a copy of Cato's letters in them. This is a pretty popular reading among the colonists. Now, who in the 1770s would have had a library? The wealthy, right? The wealthy. These are the ones who are having access to Cato's letters. This is how this is one of the ways in which people like John Adams, George Washington, and Ben Franklin, this is in some ways how they are encountering the ideas of republicanism, the principles of republicanism. Yes, they would have learned from their history lessons of the Greek and Roman empires, but they also would have been inspired by Republican principles from reading these authors. You don't need to, I mean, I think the Yacht book will mention their actual names, Jonathan Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. My point is, the people we call our founding fathers, they are learning republicanism, ironically, from England. And it's important to understand the context in which they're learning them. It's not like Trenchard and Gordon are writing these letters saying, hey, England's great, everyone should be like us. They're saying, England's not so great, it could be better. It's a critical take on England as a Republican society. And people we call our founding fathers, this is the kind of republicanism they're consuming. They're consuming Republican principles, but not Republican principles in the abstract. They're consuming Republican principles as critiques of England and its English policy. Now, what does all this have to do with the American Revolution? Remember I said taxes, policies like quartering of soldiers, the Boston Massacre, these are not self-interpreted. It's possible to have different interpretations of these events. The people we call our founding fathers encountered the Molasses Act and the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties and the Boston Massacre and the quartering of soldiers and the Intolerable Acts, encountered them as Republican thinkers, encountered them as people who imagined they were a part of a Republican empire already, the British Empire, as people who were already celebrated their rights as Englishmen. They were not just simply the most powerful people, they were the freest people in the world. They imagined themselves. But as Republicans, they were constantly looking over their shoulder. Who is looking to take away my freedom? Who is looking to take away my rights? Where is power being arbitrarily exercised? Republicanism plays a significant role in the American Revolution. Republicanism is the framework by which the colonists make sense of British policies. It's not the taxes and the stamps and the quartering of soldiers in and of themselves. It's the fact that the founders are reading these events as Republicans. And so it's not England's taxing us so they can pay down its war debt. It's England's taxing us because England's losing its virtue. England is stopping being a model Republican empire. The politicians there, who for their private interests are looking to use their power to rob their citizens of their property through taxes. If they're robbing them of their property, robbing them of their rights. There are people in England who are looking to enslave the colonists of North America. First, they tried to keep us in through our proclamation of 1763. Now, we're trying to take away our property, take away our political being. Why are they doing this? As Republicans, Ben Franklin and John Adams, George Washington, see this as a conspiracy. England is losing its virtue. What do? We'll end on this. Hopefully I'll be able to get through a reading of all of it. Jonathan Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. You have all of his letters. The only letter you really need to concern yourself with is letter number 12. There are two writings during the Imperial Crisis period that are really, really influential. One of them is Tom Paine's Common Sense. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. The other is Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Dickinson, he describes himself as a farmer. He's actually one of those wealthy He's a lawyer and a wealthy Quaker member of Pennsylvania's legislature. He's part of a kind of natural aristocracy of wealth, significant privilege, but he presents himself here in the midst of a particular tense moment, the Stamp Act crisis. Dickinson writes a series of letters. To put this in context, the Stamp Act crisis, this attempt by the government to pass taxes on public documents, essentially asking people to put a postage stamp and pay for putting a postage stamp on any kind of public document. People react. You'll be reading about the Stamp Act riots. I'll be lecturing on the Stamp Act riots. The king ultimately backs down, but says, hey, look, we do have a right to tax you. And more taxes are coming, the so-called Townshend duties. In the midst of this, the Stamp Act crisis is ending. The Townshend duties are about to come. Dickinson says, yeah, I really need to throw my 2 cents in. So he writes a series of letters. You don't need to worry about letters 1 through 11. Maybe if you're really into 18th century legalese, go for it. I'm not. What he does in very terrible to us, 18th century legal prose, in letters 1 through 11, what he does is go through and establish the principle of no taxation without representation. This is why England is wrong. This is why England was wrong with the Stamp Act. This is why England is wrong with the Townshend duties are about to send. No taxation without representation. It takes 11 letters to unpack that idea. If you want to read those letters, go for it. It's letter 12. Letter 12 is his last letter. Letter 12 is where it's like, okay, we know what just happened. We know what's coming. I've established that England's wrong. Where do we go from here? Listen for the language of republicanism and listen for the language being used to criticize England. My dear countrymen, some states have lost their liberty by particular accidents, but this calamity is generally owing to a decay of virtue. A people is traveling fast to destruction when individuals consider their interests as distinct from those of the public. Such notions are fatal to their country and to themselves. Yet how many there are so weak and sordid as to think they perform all the offices of life, that they earnestly endeavor to increase their own wealth, power, and credit without the least regard for society and the protection of which they live, who, if they can make an immediate profit of themselves by lending their assistance to those whose projects plainly tend to the injury of the country, rejoice in their dexterity and believe themselves entitled to the character of able politicians. Miserable men, of whom it is hard to say whether they ought to be most the objects of pity or contempt, but whose opinions are certainly as detestable as their practices are destructive. Though I reflect with a high pleasure on the integrity and understanding of my countrymen, which, joined with the pure and humble devotion to the great and gracious author of every blessing they enjoy, will, I hope, ensure to them and their posterity all temporal and eternal happiness. Yet, when I consider that in every age and country there have been bad men, my heart at this threatening period is so full of apprehension. This does not permit me to believe that there may be someone as confident against whom you ought to be on your guard. Men who either hold or expect to hold certain advantages by setting examples of servility to their countrymen serve as decoys for drawing the innocent and unwary into snares. Let these truths be indelibly impressed on your minds. We cannot be happy without being free. We cannot be free without being secure in our property. We cannot be secure in our property if without our consent others may as by right take it away. The taxes imposed on us by Parliament do thus take it away. The duties laid for the sole purpose of raising money are taxes. That attempts to lay such duties should be instantly and firmly opposed. That is the opposition can never be effectual unless it is the united effort of these provinces. Take care of our rights, and we will therein take care of our prosperity. Slavery is ever preceded by sleep. To discharge this double duty to yourselves and to your posterity, you have nothing to do but to call forth and to use good sense and spirit of which you are possessed. You have nothing to do but to conduct your affairs peaceably, prudently, firmly, jointly. By these means, you will support the character of freemen without losing that of faithful subjects. A good character in any government, one of the best under a British government, you will prove that Americans have that true generosity of soul that can resent injuries without falling into a rage, and that though your devotion to Great Britain is most affectionate, yet you can make proper distinctions and know what you owe to yourselves as well as to her. You can read the whole thing for yourself if you want. Dickinson is not saying at this time, hey, let's break away from England. But those two words, proper distinction, really radical. Here's England's interests. We have our interests too. Even the fact that he's using the term Americans to suggest that somehow Americans are different than the British. The idea of being an American is something that this generation is starting to think about themselves, and they're thinking about it in the midst of maybe it's not the best to be British anymore. Maybe we are such people. It's a proper distinction. Maybe American interests and British interests. Now, he's not saying let's break away. What he is saying, what he'll support resistance. We'll talk more about non-importation and some of the peaceful efforts at resistance and good old John Dickinson's role in those. But understand what the context is in which he's making these claims. It's a Republican framework. Why is England passing these taxes on us? Because it's trying to raise revenue to pay down its war debt, a completely reasonable policy stance from the crown? No. There are bad men, Dickinson suggests. There are bad men who are letting their self-interest override the public interest. They have gotten the ears of politicians, and those politicians in turn are taking away our rights by taking away our property. England, Dickinson is suggesting, is losing its virtue. Right? This is the message of the taxes, right? It's not the taxes according to soldiers in the Boston Massacre and the tea and all that stuff. Those things all isolated don't add up to let's break away from England. They only make sense if they are part of a coordinated conspiracy, a conspiracy that our founders were led to believe because they were these small R Republicans. They believed that England was losing its virtue. And they were going to destroy the colonies. They were going to drag the colonies. I mean, this is one of the most conservative revolutions. This was a revolution that was led by individuals who adored being English, loved the rights they enjoyed as the rights of Englishmen. They believed that the rights of Englishmen were superior to any other people and any other rights. But they convinced themselves, for a variety of reasons, that England was committed to ruining them, to taking away their freedom, to taking away their ability to govern themselves, to grow up, to have freedom. In 1767, it's proper distinctions, let's resist. By 1775, 1776, let's break away. But it is a revolution conducted in the name of the rights of Englishmen. The rights to preserve Republican principles here in North America now that they have been lost. So understand the way that smaller republicanism was used by our founders as a critical tool to justify independence. Have a good day.
You got great words.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, apologies.